I'm a zookeeper. Something is very wrong with the animals here. Part 2. I didn't know the rest for months following that terrible night. The faces of the animals slipped into my dreams, their skin twisting and deforming in ways that were beyond what was natural. Their lips would move in an all too human way, forming inaudible words, talking to me about something. Night after night, I would wake up drenched in my own sweat. I knew that something was wrong, and by now, the rest of my staff were catching on too. But the higher-ups were determined to squeeze all the money they could out of the last few months of summer. Closure was unthinkable. All our worst fears were confirmed when the warning alarms droned into my office, almost rattling the pane of glass from my window. My heart plunged down into the icy pit of my stomach. I knew too well what that sound meant. It was one that every person who's ever worked in a zoo hopes to never hear. One of the animals had escaped. A sudden burst of static drew my attention to the radio, half hidden under a mound of paperwork. I pulled it to my ear and heard a sobbing male voice amidst the hissing interface. The breaths were so rapid that I struggled to make out the words he was saying. Hello? It's Toby, sir. Toby, one of the newest interns here. He was a gangly kid with a shock of red hair, fresh out of college and with a permanent nervous quiver to him. Despite my own growing fears, I couldn't help but feel bad for him. He sounded like he was terrified out of his mind. Toby, what's going on out there? He sucked in air, trying to control his whimpers. It's a code red. I ran a hand over my reverting hairline. The situation was so much worse than I assumed it to be. A code red was the highest threat on the scale. It meant a dangerous animal escape, usually a big cat. As I raced from my office, my immediate concerns, as per protocol, were the protection of my staff, attendees, and the animal. I knew that the situation had to be handled delicately. One mistake could result in injury or death. I knew that the lion was roaming around disoriented and was bound to attack if we sprung out at it. When an animal was cornered, that was when it was at its most dangerous. We had to employ stealth in containing them. Another voice crackled over the radio. Code red, lion in the reptile house. I repeat, code red, lion in the reptile house. Do you copy? Unlike Toby, this voice was female and a lot more recognizable. Annie, our zoo veterinarian. Someone who knew what she was doing. Copy, I gritted into the radio. My eyes surveyed the normally bustling grounds, now completely emptied of people. Candy packaging and leaflets rolled across the ground in the wind, which pattered against the sun-streaked glass of the exhibits. I was more than glad that any civilians had been evacuated, but I couldn't shake off that growing discomfort. That's when it hit me. The animals were all silent, just watching me from inside their own habitats. A panda stared out with a deadened black bead while gnawing a shard of bamboo while the birds swayed on their branches. I turned around to find a chimpanzee, his face compressed against the glass, flaring nostrils clouding against the surface. His lips receded into a fanged grin. They were like an avid audience to the whole spectacle, all waiting to see how it played out. I walked on, trying not to make eye contact with any of them, and soon found the reptile house rounding into my peripheral vision, a blue tarpaulin already constructed. By now, the emergency zoo response team had already assembled, unloading their tranquilizer guns. I saw Annie holding a syringe, a powerful sedative oozing from its pointed tip. My shoulders sagged in relief. Annie, please tell me you know what's going on. She shook her head with such vigor that a neatly tucked strand of her auburn bun came loose, falling over an eyebrow. No idea. Samson just went insane. Smashed through the glass like it was nothing, she murmured. She gestured down to a spotted path of blood that disappeared into the open doorway of the exhibit. Took some pretty heavy lacerations. I'm afraid about him bleeding out. Then we better move quickly, I told her. She nodded, her expression as stoic as ever, a beacon of professionalism standing over the waves of fear that threatened to wash over us. I raised my hands in the air. No sudden movements, I told them. I was determined to keep order amongst them. The most important part of dealing with a potentially dangerous animal was to not panic. I knew that losing your cool was what got people killed. Our steps were slow and timed as to not startle the lion. We followed the wavering beams of our flashlights into the flickering hall of the reptile house. The ceiling light had been damaged in the initial rush of evacuation, leaving it sputtering randomly between being brightly lit and near total darkness. Our group froze when our light shone on the defined back of a 500-pound male adult lion. One of the other keepers had the tranquilizer gun cocked in his trembling hand when it turned to us. I wanted to call the thing that stood in front of us Samson, but I knew I couldn't. It wasn't him anymore. Blood streamed down the sides of its face from its eyes, half dried into its tawny fur. There was so much of it that the orange-brown of its eyes was now red. Its mouth was stretched into a jagged grin, so wide that it looked like its face had split open trying to do so, exposing pale pink jaw muscle. I had never seen any animal move the way it did, and I hope that I never do again. Its heavy, pounding paws jerked around with every step into unnatural angles. It was as if it was moving around on broken limbs. His eyes bounced around as it prowled, rolling around as if they were loose in its skull. Clumps of its darkened mane were scattered to the ground, exposing blistered flesh. Toby's sneakers scraped against the floor, but I grabbed the collar of his shirt just as he was about to take into a full sprint. I hadn't realized he was there until I saw his pale face blinking out in the darkness. But right now, I didn't have time to chew out the rest for bringing an intern along with them. "Don't run. Walk away slowly," I told him. I knew he would never be fast enough if he decided to go after him. Its lower jaw juddered to the point it looked ready to fall off. Then the noise filtered through the air, loud and barking. It was laughing at us, in some low, deep animal imitation of a human voice, exposing a line of sharp, glimmering teeth. Its head began to shake so much that it blurred. Its eyeballs squelched to the floor, leaving behind two black, vacant holes. Behind me, Toby purged the contents of his stomach onto the floor. We were all frozen, unable to turn away from the horrific spectacle unfolding in front of us. Two dark, thorny spikes were expelled from out the emptied sockets. It was like we were watching sped-up footage of a plant growing. Something that should have taken years was happening in seconds. We watched as it extended and thickened to the point that it strained the bone. They soon jutted out almost a foot in front of its head. Unable to stomach any more, Toby wrestled the gun off of one of the other keepers and fired 3 darts into it before I could stop him. Instead of stopping it, a ripple ran through its body like an air hose had been inserted into it, inflating the layers of skin and muscle. The darts that had been embedded within it popped out and scattered onto the floor. Then it charged. Toby barely had a chance to react as bony growths jutted from its now blind eyes, gored right through him. His eyes widened as they shredded his lungs, the sharp tips bursting out of his back. His mouth fell open, red streaming out and staining his shirt. It shook him off, leaving his broken body to soak in a growing pool of his own blood. It sniffed at the air, horns still dripping. We scattered as it bowled through us. Most of us found ourselves with our backs pressed up against the walls, but one found his leg clenched within its powerful jaws. It shook him like a cat with a bird, raking its claws over his face. Bloodied strips of skin fell to the floor. His screams rang through the darkness. I closed my eyes, almost erecting a mental block. My feet shifted against the floor, knees tensing up at the slightest sound they made. But I forced myself to keep moving. In the waning light, I saw Annie on the other side of the thing, her arms splayed up against the wall, trying to avoid being detected. The thin glass cylinder of a syringe jutting out of its back just below its neck, but the massive dosage of drugs just didn't seem to register in its changed body. Pressing a finger to my lips, I waved my hand along to her. The thing tore into the keeper's innards, maw flecked with gore. I flinched every time its nostrils flared, thinking that our presence had been exposed. While it was distracted, we rounded up what remained of our number and left as quietly as we could. The potential pain of being torn apart by whatever Samson had now become was nothing compared to the one I felt at leaving 2 of us behind. The lack of stable lighting would buy us some time. or so I hoped. As we ran down the hallway, I could already hear the pounding paws echoing from around the corners. The snakes writhed up against their glass walls, rhythmically tapping against it. The streaming light at the end of the passageway was already fading with the metallic whirring of the falling shutters. The only coherent thought that I could hear over the rush of adrenaline and blood was please, please God, let us get out of here alive. After what seemed like a lifetime in the darkness, the outside light invaded my eyes, almost blinding me. I lost my footing and ended up half sprawled out onto the ground. The others stumbled out behind me. Annie clutched her chest, trying to control her own frantic breathing. The iron screen shook as its head smashed into it, to the point I was sure it would burst open. This was followed by a piercing series of grinding sounds, which was probably it trying to claw its way out. After managing to catch my breath, my managerial mode kicked back in with a vengeance. Come on, we need to get to the main building. There will be supplies there, a phone. We can call somebody for help. My words seemed to hang in the air. The others stood frozen around me, staring out to the exhibits, mouths open. I felt myself go cold at their expressions. I forced myself up on my trembling knees. The sun streamed through the gaping hole in the surface of the glass pane of the chimpanzee exhibit. Fragmented glass was scattered all over the ground, which glowed in the patterned light that streamed through the swaying trees. The chimpanzees were already long gone. As I was fumbling for my radio, Annie's firm hand pulled me around, and I saw that the rest of the animals had vanished too. In every exhibit, there was almost an identical hole torn through. A wind howled through the emptied habitats. The world weighed down on my back to the point where I felt my spine buckle under it. We were rooted to the spot, the sensation of dozens of unseen eyes burning into our flesh, hidden in plain sight and ready to pounce and tear us into shreds at any given moment. There was only one word left on my mind that could sum up our predicament. Fuck.